Mr. Blue wants to open his own business. Episode 9. Mr. Blue will search for ways to deal with the finance of his new business. In the last episode, Mr. Blue learned a few ways to develop his business idea, focusing on design thinking and lean startup. His goal is to develop an idea that will not satisfy his needs, but that of his future customers. In this episode, Mr. Blue will learn how to deal with money. Searching the internet, Mr. Blue found that most of the new business money comes from the founders and their families. Although everybody talks about investors like business angels and venture capitalists, the beginning of the company is an effort from founders like him. More than half of the new company's money comes from the founders. This process is called bootstrapping. But, above all, Mr. Blue is very clear about one thing. If he wants to manage the money of a company, he has to be able to manage his own personal money. Simple ideas like having a monthly budget of the money coming into his bank account and the money going out of it can make a lot of difference. When he moved to Norway, dealing with money became a very different thing than when he was living in his country. There he knew the basics about taxes, personal and corporate, banking operations, and, maybe the most important thing, he had a network of friends and family with whom he could talk about his finances. In Norway, he practically had to start from zero. Many times he felt almost desperate. In his country, for example, the state was not really interested in his effort to have a good life. It was corrupt and served the political group that was in power. A very important lesson he learned is that in Norway, the state is very different. This is one of the most organized and efficient countries in the world, and it cares for its citizens. He also learned that in Norway, everybody has to pay taxes. As they say here, alle nordmenn må betale skatt. Mr. Blue decided that as an immigrant who wants to integrate in society, he had to pay his personal taxes adequately. His company also had to be well organized and efficient, like any Norwegian company, and pay taxes. Having that in mind, Mr. Blue started to plan the finance of his new business. As an immigrant, he would not easily get any financial support from the state to open his company. So, like everybody else, he had to bootstrap, which means he had to save money before he opened his new company. Mr. Blue can bootstrap in many different ways. 1. Keep his costs to the minimum until his company grows a little. For example, instead of renting his own office space, he can use a co-working space. 2. He should avoid paying interest on a loan as it would increase his costs. He should never use his credit card. 3. He can decrease his advertisement expenses by using his social media, for example, using Google AdWords. And 4. He should also avoid hiring new employees until his business is stable. He can use the help of his family and friends, for example. The first thing he had to do was to understand that the finances of a company work very much like giving a loan to a friend or relative. He would loan his money to somebody, expecting to get it back more than he had before. That would be his profit for taking a risk. He could lose everything, so he had to be careful. In this example, Mr. Blue understood that looking at the profit, 200 kroner, alone is not a good idea. Even 1 billion kroner could not be a good profit if the company invested a lot of money, For example, 100 billion kroner. The important thing about the profit is to compare it with the money he had to invest. This is called return on investment. In this example, his return on investment was 20%. The return on his investment is more important than the size of the profit itself. This is the financial lesson number 1. But how long did it take Mr. Blue to have his return of 20%? If Mr. Blue have had a return on investment of 20% in one day, he should celebrate it because he would be a genius or a speculator. If Mr. Blue had made a return on investment of 20% in 1 year, would that be good? Here is financial lesson number 2. To check if your return on investment is good, Mr. Blue always has to compare it to other investments. Mr. Blue checked the internet for different returns if he had invested in other things. He wrote down his findings. If Mr. Blue could get a return on investment of 20% per year in his new company, that would be fantastic. But he doesn't know how much profit his company will give him in 1 year. He doesn't even know if there will be a profit. This is why Mr. Blue should make a budget for the future of his company, just the same way he makes a budget for his personal accounts with his family. This is called a forecast, or cash flow forecast, and he can estimate his return using a tool called internal rate of return. In order to learn this tool and to use a simple example, Mr. Blue imagined the forecast of an ice cream truck. He used Excel to input the numbers and calculate the internal rate of return. Mr. Blue estimated the cost of the truck and some extra cash, working capital, his sales, and the costs to calculate the net cash flow. In this example, Excel calculated the internal rate of return as 26%. As it is higher than the return he would get from other investments in Norway, he understands he could continue. If his estimates are reasonable, because his idea is financially viable. Of course, this was just a simple exercise to learn a tool. If Mr. Blue really wanted to open an ice cream truck, he would have to be more careful, and all of the numbers should have a very good explanation. But he is satisfied, because he learned 2 important financial lessons, and he can forecast his new business finances. Mr. Blue now understands how the finances of a company work. He learned important lessons and wants to learn even more. In the next episode, Mr. Blue will put in practice everything he learned since episode 1 and will design a business idea.